The story begins in the aftermath of a broken empire. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, lay wounded yet restless. Its people were stripped of pride, its army dismantled, its economy in ruins. But amid the rubble, one man looked at the shattered map of Europe and saw opportunity where others saw defeat. His name was Adolf Hitler, and for a fleeting span of years, his vision of conquest almost reshaped the modern world. By 1933, the world barely noticed how quickly the man with the tiny mustache transformed political anger into national unity. He did not begin with tanks or planes. He began with words. Hitler's greatest early weapon was not the Wehrmacht, but the illusion of destiny. When he spoke of rebuilding the fatherland, millions listened. Behind closed doors, he rearmed in defiance of treaties, built factories disguised as civilian plants, and resurrected the Luftwaffe under the nose of a distracted Europe. Britain was preoccupied with empire. France hid behind the Maginot Line. The United States turned inward, and while the world debated, Germany prepared. By 1936, the Rhineland was remilitarized. It was a gamble that could have ended the dream before it began. France could have crushed his small army with ease, but no shot was fired. Hitler watched his officers return from the Rhineland like conquering heroes and realized a terrifying truth. His enemies feared war more than he did. It was then that he learned the first secret of his success. Boldness was as powerful as bullets. As the world looked away, Hitler perfected Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a concept that would soon terrify nations. Instead of static defense, he envisioned speed, armor, and air coordination. Generals like Guderian and Manstein refined the theory. The panzer divisions were trained to move as one living organism. Tanks breaking lines, aircraft striking ahead, infantry sealing the pocket. It was a dance of steel and precision, and when unleashed, it would rewrite the art of war. In 1938, the Anschluss absorbed Austria without resistance. German troops crossed the border, not as invaders, but as liberators greeted by cheering crowds. The map of Europe tilted slightly eastward, and still, no one acted. Later that year came the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia dismembered with the blessing of Britain and France. Chamberlain returned home, waving a paper promising peace in our time. Hitler smiled privately. He had conquered two nations without a single battle. His gamble was working. Bluff, intimidation, and the paralysis of democracies. By September 1939, when he struck at Poland, Germany was ready. The Wehrmacht moved with unprecedented coordination. 1.5 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and screaming dive bombers tearing through the sky. Within weeks, the Polish defense collapsed. Britain and France declared war, but remained behind their fortifications while Poland was erased. The Soviet Union, bound by the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded from the east, sealing the nation's fate. Europe was at war again, but Hitler stood triumphant. His generals marveled. The plan had worked with chilling efficiency. The world had underestimated Germany's rebirth. Then came what historians later called the phony war. For months, nothing happened on the Western Front. Britain and France hesitated, while Hitler planned his next lightning strike. In April 1940, he moved north. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway, though resistant, was overrun in weeks. The occupation of Norway gave Hitler the northern coastline and access to the iron ore shipments he needed to sustain his war machine. It was a move of economic and strategic genius, a rare moment when political daring and logistical necessity perfectly aligned. But it was in 1940, in the invasion of France, that Hitler's near victory came frighteningly close to perfection. The French army was considered the strongest in Europe, its Maginot Line impregnable. Yet Hitler, guided by Manstein's bold plan, sent his main forces through the Ardennes, a region the Allies deemed impassable to tanks. It was the ultimate deception. Within days, the panzers burst through Sedan, cutting off Allied armies in Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force retreated toward Dunkirk, their backs to the sea. For a moment, it seemed the British would be annihilated, the war finished before it truly began. And here lies one of the great what-ifs of history. Hitler ordered a halt to the panzers outside Dunkirk, allowing the Luftwaffe to finish the job. Hermann Göring assured him the bombers would crush the trapped armies. But the weather changed, the skies turned cloudy, and the Royal Navy, aided by civilian boats, evacuated more than 300,000 men across the Channel. Britain's army escaped by miracle and miscalculation. Had Hitler pressed the attack for 2 more days, Europe's fate might have been sealed. Even his own generals could not explain the pause. Some claimed he wanted to spare Britain, hoping for peace. Others said he simply hesitated. Whatever the reason, it was the first time chance betrayed him. Still, the victory was dazzling. In 6 weeks, France fell. Paris was occupied. The armistice signed in the same railway carriage where Germany had been humiliated in 1918. The tables had turned. Europe trembled before a new master. By mid-1940, Hitler controlled everything from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. The swastika flew over the Eiffel Tower. German soldiers stood on the shores of the Channel, gazing across at England. Only one small island nation stood between Hitler and total domination of Western Europe. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was the next great gamble. To succeed, Germany needed control of the skies. The Luftwaffe began its assault in July 1940. The Battle of Britain was not only a fight for air superiority, but a test of endurance. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted airfields and radar stations, inflicting heavy damage. Britain's RAF struggled to keep pace. But a strategic mistake changed everything. After a small RAF raid on Berlin, Hitler demanded revenge. The bombing shifted from military targets to cities. Night after night, London burned, but the RAF was given breathing space to recover. Pilots like Douglas Bader and the outnumbered squadrons of the few turned the tide. By October, the Luftwaffe was exhausted, losses mounting. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. It was Hitler's first major defeat, and one that would prove irreversible. Had he persisted with airfields and radar instead of terror bombing, the RAF might have collapsed. Britain could have been invaded or forced to negotiate. Instead, the island held, and the war endured. Yet even in defeat, Hitler's confidence grew. He believed Britain stood only because it hoped for help from America or Russia. To end that hope, he turned east. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 was driven by ideology and impatience. He saw the USSR as the last major continental threat and a vast reservoir of land and resources. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, stretched across a front of 1,800 miles. It was a storm of steel and ambition. At first, it seemed unstoppable. Soviet armies crumbled under the German advance. Whole divisions were encircled and destroyed. Kiev, Smolensk, Minsk, all fell in rapid succession. German soldiers captured millions of prisoners. Stalin himself was paralyzed in shock for days. By autumn, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. The world held its breath. If Moscow fell, the Soviet Union might have disintegrated, and Hitler would have owned Eurasia from the Atlantic to the Urals. But here again, fate intervened. The campaign, planned as a short summer war, dragged into winter. The Germans were unprepared for the cold. Fuel froze, engines stalled. Soldiers lacked proper clothing. Reinforcements from Siberia, freed by Stalin after learning Japan would not attack from the east, arrived to counterattack. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army struck back. For the first time, the German army was forced to retreat. Moscow held. The myth of invincibility was broken. Yet even then, the balance could have tipped differently. Had the invasion begun 6 weeks earlier, had Hitler allowed his generals to focus solely on Moscow, rather than diverting armies to Ukraine, history might have turned his way. Only 2 days after the counterattack began, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Hitler, in one of his most fateful decisions, declared war on the United States. What had begun as a continental struggle now became a global war he could not possibly win. But in late 1941, few realized it. The Wehrmacht still occupied most of Europe, North Africa, and large parts of the Soviet Union. Hitler had come closer to world domination than any conqueror in modern times. For the next year, he would continue to press forward. His scientists worked on rockets and jet engines years ahead of the Allies. The U-boat campaign strangled the Atlantic. The Afrika Korps, under Rommel, chased the British across the desert. The Nazi Empire seemed unshakable, yet beneath the surface, the cracks were widening. The same overconfidence that had fueled his rise would begin to turn against him. The momentum of lightning war was slowing, and every missed opportunity, the pause at Dunkirk, the shift in the skies over London, the frozen roads before Moscow, would soon demand a price he could no longer afford to pay. As the snow melted on the Eastern Front in the spring of 1942, Hitler still believed the previous winter's setback was only a pause, not a defeat. He convinced himself that the Red Army had been shattered, and that one last campaign could finish the job. His eyes turned south, to the Caucasus, to the oil fields of Baku, to the black fuel that could power the Reich for decades. Operation Blue, the grand offensive of 1942, would seize the Soviet Union's lifeblood. If successful, Germany would no longer fear shortages. The war machine would be unstoppable. At first, it worked. The Germans surged eastward again, cutting through Soviet defenses like a knife through glass. Town after town fell. Hitler's radio speeches thundered with confidence. He told his generals that destiny itself was guiding them. But fate has its own rhythm. The further his armies advanced, the longer their supply lines stretched. Each mile of conquest cost more fuel, more men, more time. And once again, Hitler's impatience undermined his strategy. Obsessed with symbols, he divided his forces, half to capture the Caucasus oil, half to take the city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad, even the name enraged him. To destroy the city bearing Stalin's name became a matter of pride. Yet that pride would doom him. The battle began in late summer 1942. It was supposed to last weeks. It lasted months. The Luftwaffe reduced the city to rubble, but the Soviets turned that rubble into a fortress. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army held on. German troops fought hand to hand amid the ruins, losing thousands each day. But Hitler refused to withdraw. When winter returned, Soviet forces encircled the entire Sixth Army. Inside the frozen city, 300,000 German soldiers were trapped with little food, little ammunition, and no escape. Even then, Hitler believed he could still win. He ordered them to stand fast, promising that supplies would come by air. They did not. When the Sixth Army finally surrendered in February 1943, the world saw the myth of Nazi invincibility crumble. It was the largest defeat Germany had ever suffered. Yet behind the tragedy, there lay another story, how close he had come once again to victory. If the oil fields of the Caucasus had fallen, if Stalingrad had been bypassed rather than besieged, the Soviet Union might have collapsed from lack of fuel. Germany's tanks, aircraft, and submarines ran on synthetic fuels and stolen stockpiles. A direct pipeline to Baku's oil could have extended the war indefinitely. The Allies knew it. Stalin knew it. Only luck and Hitler's pride prevented it. While the disaster unfolded in the east, another battle was taking shape far to the south. In North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was achieving miracles with little support. His Africa Corps danced across the sands, defeating larger British forces time and again. The Germans pushed to El Alamein, only a few hundred miles from the Suez Canal. Had they broken through, they could have seized the canal, choked off Britain's lifeline to India, and linked up with German forces advancing from the Caucasus. It was a plan Hitler quietly dreamed of, a meeting of armies across the Middle East that would trap the British Empire in a vice. For a time, it seemed possible. The British were stretched thin, morale low, supplies uncertain, but logistics again betrayed the Reich. The Royal Navy controlled the Mediterranean. Rommel's convoys from Italy were constantly attacked. Fuel arrived in drops rather than rivers. At El Alamein in late 1942, Rommel's momentum died. General Montgomery's forces, heavily supplied by American aid, struck back. The Desert Fox retreated west. The dream of linking the fronts across Eurasia evaporated into the desert heat. Yet even then, the balance of power remained uncertain. Germany still occupied most of Europe, from the Atlantic coast to the Volga. The U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was strangling Britain's supply lines. By early 1943, Allied shipping losses reached terrifying levels. Millions of tons sunk each month. For a while, it seemed Britain might starve before America could build enough escorts and radar to counter the threat. Historians often forget how close the U-boats came to victory. If the new acoustic torpedoes and improved submarines had been deployed 6 months earlier, the Atlantic might have been lost. And without Atlantic convoys, no D-Day could ever have been launched. In secret laboratories across Germany, scientists worked on weapons that seemed drawn from the future. Jet fighters, guided missiles, even plans for atomic research flickered on drawing boards. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, could fly faster than any Allied plane. The V-2 rocket would soon reign from the stratosphere. Had these projects matured just a year earlier, they could have changed everything. Allied bombers might never have reached German cities. In those laboratories lay one of the war's most haunting almosts. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Hitler refused to learn from his mistakes. He saw Stalingrad not as a warning, but as proof that his generals lacked faith. He took personal control of strategy, moving divisions on maps from his distant headquarters. Operation Citadel, in 1943, the great offensive at Kursk, was meant to restore the initiative. It would be the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of panzers facing thousands of Soviet T-34s across the plains. The Germans planned to strike in spring, but delays pushed the attack to July. By then, the Soviets had dug miles of defenses, laid millions of mines, and prepared counterattacks. When the battle began, German tanks advanced into a fortress of steel. For days they fought fiercely, especially at the village of Prokhorovka, where tanks clashed at point-blank range. But the element of surprise was gone. Soviet depth defenses absorbed the assault. When news arrived that the Allies had landed in Sicily, Hitler halted the operation. Kursk was lost. It was the last great German offensive in the East. After that, the Wehrmacht would never again go on the attack. Yet the remarkable truth is this. Even after Stalingrad and Kursk, Germany's defeat was not inevitable. In 1943, the Reich still produced more weapons than any other European nation. Its jet and rocket programs were months from readiness. And deep within occupied territories, secret negotiations flickered. Offers to split the Allies, to make peace with the West, and continue the fight against the East. If any of these gambits had succeeded, the map might have changed again. One such scheme involved Admiral Canaris and elements of the German intelligence service, who hinted to the Allies that a post-Hitler Germany could realign itself against Stalin. But mistrust and secrecy doomed these efforts. The Allies had pledged unconditional surrender. There could be no compromise. And so, even opportunities for diplomacy slipped away. Through all this, Hitler's health and judgment deteriorated. Surrounded by flatterers, cut off from reality, he made decisions based on intuition and emotion rather than military logic. His obsession with no-retreat orders destroyed entire armies that might have lived to fight again. Still, he believed that new weapons, the wonder weapons, as propaganda called them, would soon turn defeat into victory. In 1943, those promises began to take shape. Engineers tested the V-1 flying bomb, a pilotless missile that buzzed over the English Channel like a mechanical wasp. The V-2 rocket, its successor, could soar into the edge of space before striking without warning. The technology was decades ahead of its time. Had Germany possessed mass production capacity for these weapons earlier, the impact could have been catastrophic. Imagine hundreds of V-2s hitting London daily in 1942 instead of 1944, before Allied air power dominated the skies. Britain might have been forced to the bargaining table, and the invasion of Europe delayed indefinitely. Meanwhile, in occupied France, the Atlantic Wall was rising. Thousands of bunkers, gun emplacements, and concrete fortresses stretching from Norway to Spain. To Hitler, it was the shield that would protect his empire from invasion. In reality, it was built on deception and overconfidence. He believed the Allies would never dare cross the Channel, while the Wehrmacht still held the continent. He underestimated not only their determination, but also their capacity to deceive. Back in Berlin, as 1943 drew to a close, the once mighty Reich was beginning to wobble. Allied bombers were striking deeper each night, reducing cities to ash. The Eastern Front had swallowed millions of men. Yet in the corridors of power, Hitler remained convinced that the war could still be won. He told his ministers that the enemy coalition was unstable, that Britain and America would soon quarrel with the Soviets. "We must hold out one more year," he said again and again. "One more year, and history will turn." And for a brief, haunting moment, he was almost right. In the early months of 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, the balance of power was narrower than later memory suggests. German armies still occupied Europe, their defenses formidable. Jet fighters began to appear in squadrons. The V-1 and V-2 programs neared operational status. U-boats equipped with new snorkels threatened to return to the Atlantic. A secret plan to assassinate Eisenhower circulated among intelligence circles. The Third Reich was wounded, but not yet dying. This was the world at the turning point. A moment when Hitler's empire could still, with one or two decisive strokes, alter the course of history. But time, resources, and reason were slipping away. What had begun as a calculated quest for dominance was becoming a desperate struggle for survival. By 1944, the Reich still appeared immense on the map. From the beaches of Normandy to the snow of the Baltic, from the Balkans to the edge of the Black Sea, Hitler's empire stretched wider than Napoleon's had ever done. But behind that expanse lay exhaustion. Cities smoldered, fuel reserves shrank, and the front lines stretched too far for any army to hold. Yet Hitler's belief in destiny never faltered. He saw himself as chosen by fate to defy the world, and he clung to that conviction even as the world closed in. Still, the war's outcome was not yet written. In early 1944, Hitler's scientists and generals produced a series of plans that, if realized in time, could have delayed or even reversed the Allied advance. The first was the Atlantic Wall, his massive defensive line meant to make Europe impregnable. It stretched 2,400 miles along the coast. Guns, mines, bunkers, and beach obstacles designed to annihilate any invasion force. German engineers believed it was unbreakable. The Allies, however, planned not only to invade, but to deceive. Through Operation Bodyguard, a complex web of double agents, fake radio signals, and dummy armies, they convinced Hitler that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Even as Allied ships assembled in the Channel, Hitler's armies waited in the wrong place. When the invasion began on June 6, 1944, German commanders near Normandy begged for permission to deploy the panzer divisions. But Hitler, convinced it was a feint, refused to move them. For 15 crucial hours, he slept, unaware that the fate of Europe was being decided on the beaches. When he finally realized the truth, it was too late. The Allies had established a foothold. Yet even then, victory was far from certain. The Germans fought with incredible ferocity. Rommel, now in command of the Western defenses, launched desperate counterattacks that nearly drove the Allies back into the sea. In the first weeks of the Normandy campaign, Allied casualties were staggering, supply lines chaotic, and morale shaken. Had the panzer reserves been unleashed immediately on D-Day morning, the beaches could have become killing grounds. Even Eisenhower privately drafted a note accepting the possibility of defeat. The invasion's success, so certain in hindsight, was never guaranteed. A single decisive counterblow might have changed everything. But Rommel's warnings went unheard. Hitler's refusal to delegate authority crippled his armies, and when the resistance against him from within his own ranks culminated in the July 20 assassination attempt, he emerged alive but paranoid. The bomb placed by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg exploded, wounding but not killing him. The plot's failure led to brutal purges that destroyed what little independent thought remained in the German officer corps. From that moment on, strategy was dictated by ideology, not reason. Hitler saw every setback as a test of faith, every defeat as proof of treachery rather than tactical error. Yet the story of 1944 is not merely one of collapse. It is also one of near-miracle recoveries. After the fall of France in August, the Allies believed Germany's defeat was imminent. But in the autumn, Hitler prepared one last grand counterattack, a plan so bold that even his generals were stunned. He would strike in the Ardennes once more. The same forest route that had brought him victory in 1940. The objective was to split the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. He called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, but history would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, under cover of dense fog, German tanks and infantry stormed through the snow-covered forests of Belgium. The attack caught the Allies completely off guard. American units, believing the war almost won, were resting or scattered. In the first days, chaos reigned. Entire divisions were surrounded or annihilated. The Germans captured thousands of prisoners and pushed the front line deep into Belgium, creating the famous bulge in Allied lines. For a brief moment, it looked as though Hitler had done the impossible, turned back the tide of invasion, and divided his enemies. If the weather had remained cloudy, for one more week, grounding Allied aircraft. The offensive might have reached the Meuse River. Fuel shortages and stubborn resistance stopped the panzers only miles short. By Christmas, the skies cleared, and Allied planes returned in force, shredding German columns from above. The offensive collapsed, but the shock was profound. It reminded the world that even at the brink of defeat, the Reich could still strike with deadly precision. Behind these battlefield gambles were darker projects, schemes that showed how far Hitler was willing to go to reverse his fortunes. In late 1944, German scientists were racing to create weapons of terror. The V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket began pounding London and Antwerp. These missiles, unstoppable by contemporary defenses, killed thousands. But they were more psychological than strategic. Each explosion carried the whisper of what might have been. Had Hitler possessed them earlier, or in greater numbers, they could have crippled Allied ports, delayed the invasion, or forced Britain to sue for peace. The Allies took them so seriously that entire squadrons were assigned to hunt their launch sites. Even more secret were the efforts within the SS to develop unconventional weapons, biological agents, long-range jets, and atomic research. Though the German nuclear program lagged behind, its progress was alarming. The Allies' decision to bomb research facilities like Peenemünde was driven by genuine fear that Hitler might soon have his own superweapon. In the laboratories of scientists like Werner Heisenberg and Kurt Diebner, the outlines of a bomb project existed, though never completed. The question still haunts historians. Is the Reich had focused its vast scientific talent on one project instead of dozens? Could it have produced the ultimate weapon first? As the V weapons fell and the Ardennes offensive faltered, Hitler's faith shifted from military logic to fantasy. He began speaking of miracle weapons that would turn the war in a single stroke. His speeches promised that vengeance was coming, that secret forces would soon destroy his enemies. Some of these projects, astonishingly, were real. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, capable of outrunning any Allied plane, was ready for mass production. Pilots who flew it described it as a machine from the future. But Hitler, obsessed with offensive power, insisted it be used as a bomber instead of an interceptor. This single misjudgment may have cost Germany the skies. Had hundreds of Me-262s been deployed against Allied bombers in 1943 or early 1944, the air war could have swung dramatically. The Allies might have been forced to postpone D-Day, giving Hitler precious time to fortify Europe and regroup. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army advanced relentlessly. Soviet offensives rolled westward, liberating territory and crushing what remained of the Wehrmacht. Yet even here, the Germans managed moments of terrifying brilliance. At Narva, at Targu Frumas, at the defenses of East Prussia, small German units inflicted massive casualties, delaying the Soviet tide. These tactical successes bought time for Hitler's other plans, time that he believed might yield salvation through diplomacy or technology. And the shadows of diplomacy. There were still efforts to fracture the Allied coalition. Some within the Nazi hierarchy believed the Western powers might turn against the Soviet Union once the common enemy was gone. Propaganda hinted at a coming clash between capitalism and communism. Hitler hoped to exploit this tension. He ordered his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, to explore back-channel messages through neutral states like Sweden and Switzerland. These overtures were ignored, but the possibility lingered. If the Western Allies had sought to contain Soviet expansion instead of total victory, the post-war world might have been divided long before Berlin fell. By early 1945, the Reich was shrinking rapidly. Yet in the chaos, Hitler devised one final desperate plan. He called it the Alpine Redoubt, a mythical fortress in the mountains of southern Germany and Austria, where the regime would make its last stand. According to the propaganda, vast stores of weapons and food were hidden in secret tunnels, and elite SS units would fight from the peaks for years. In reality, it was a fantasy, a psychological ploy to convince his followers that defeat was impossible. But for months, the Allies feared it was real. Eisenhower hesitated to rush into the Alps, diverting forces that might otherwise have struck Berlin sooner. Even in defeat, Hitler's illusions managed to shape his enemy's actions. In Berlin, his bunker became the center of a collapsing universe. The city above was already in ruins, yet he refused to leave. Reports of defeat poured in daily, but he dismissed them as exaggerations or betrayal. Generals who spoke the truth were dismissed or executed. His circle grew smaller, his speeches more erratic. He spoke of invisible armies that would soon strike back, of new alliances that would turn the tide. The man who had once conquered Europe now lived in a dream of invincibility that had long ceased to exist. And yet, when historians trace the final months of the war, they still find moments, brief flashes, when the unimaginable seemed possible. If the Ardennes offensive had captured Antwerp, if the jet fighters had arrived earlier, if the atomic project had not been scattered, if the Allies had split with the Soviets, the story might have been different. The margin between triumph and disaster was often no more than a handful of decisions. A few weeks of timing, a few degrees of chance. Hitler's near-victories were built on daring and luck. His downfall came when luck finally ran out. By February 1945, Allied bombers ruled the skies. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg were consumed in firestorms that turned night into day. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army stood less than 100 miles from Berlin. Yet, even as the Reich disintegrated, Hitler issued orders for new offensives that no longer existed outside his imagination. He told his staff that the enemy would exhaust itself and that the miracle of the German resurrection was near. His generals listened in silence, knowing the war was already lost. But outside the bunker, the machinery he had built still functioned. SS units fought fanatically, civilians dug trenches, and youth divisions filled the ranks. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels continued to broadcast defiance, promising that Germany would rise again, even if it burned first. It was as if the entire nation had become trapped in the echo of its own delusion. And yet, history shows that this delusion nearly succeeded in prolonging the war far beyond reason. The Allies had expected Germany to collapse by Christmas 1944. Instead, the conflict raged into spring 1945, costing hundreds of thousands more lives. Every secret weapon, every false hope, every last-ditch defense bought Hitler weeks that he should never have had. Those weeks reshaped the map of Europe, allowing the Soviets to reach Berlin first and divide the continent for decades to come. Even in ruin, Hitler's actions continued to influence the world that followed. As 1945 dawned, Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. But inside Hitler's bunker, beneath the Reich Chancellery, the man who had once dictated the fate of nations still imagined himself a conqueror. Maps hung on the walls, red pins marking divisions that no longer existed, blue arrows showing counterattacks that would never come. To his staff, he spoke not of defeat, but of destiny. He was convinced that the Allies would soon fall apart, that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin would turn on each other, leaving Germany to rise again. Even as the walls shook from Soviet artillery, Hitler spoke as though he were still shaping the future. Above ground, Berlin was a vision of apocalypse. The city that had once symbolized modern power had become a landscape of ashes. Buildings stood like skeletons against the smoke-filled sky. Civilians moved through the ruins like ghosts, scavenging food and water as the Red Army closed in. Every bridge, every street, every intersection had been turned into a fortress. Hitler had ordered that Berlin be defended to the last man, to the last bullet. Those who tried to flee were often executed by their own soldiers. It was a death sentence for an entire city. Yet even in those final months, there remained flickers of plans so audacious they bordered on madness. One was the idea of a last resort strike, using jet aircraft armed with chemical or radioactive weapons, an act meant to shock the Allies into negotiation. German scientists had indeed developed nerve agents like taboon and sarin, weapons far more deadly than anything the world had seen. The stockpiles were real, but Hitler never ordered their use. Whether from fear of Allied retaliation or his belief that such weapons were beneath his imagined code of honor, the decision remains one of the war's strangest contradictions. Had he unleashed them, the horror might have forced the Allies to halt their advance, or plunge the world into chemical warfare decades before it became imaginable. Another of his fading dreams was the U-boat resurgence. Hidden beneath the Atlantic were hundreds of new submarines equipped with snorkels and revolutionary designs. The Type 21 U-boat, capable of remaining underwater for days and moving faster submerged than any ship on the surface. These were the world's first true submarines, not just diving boats. Their introduction came too late. If they had been ready in 1943, they might have cut Britain's supply lifeline once more and isolated Europe. Historians have called the Type 21 the weapon that arrived 2 years too late. In its steel hull lay the ghost of victory that never came. Meanwhile, in the Alps, SS leaders still clung to the fantasy of the Alpine fortress, the mythical redoubt, where Hitler's forces would retreat and wage guerrilla war for years. Factories were rumored to be hidden deep within mountains, producing jets, rockets, and missiles that would unleash vengeance. But the truth was far more desperate. There were no stockpiles, no secret fortresses, only shattered railways and hollow promises. Still, the legend served its purpose. The Allies, uncertain of its reality, slowed their final offensive to prepare for resistance that never came. Once again, Hitler's illusion bought him time, though it could no longer buy him victory. As the Soviet armies surrounded Berlin in April, Hitler's world shrank to a few hundred meters of concrete. He rarely left the bunker, emerging only to berate his generals or award decorations to boys of the Hitler Youth sent to defend the capital. He told them they were the future of Germany, though many would die within days. Reports arrived hourly, cities lost, allies surrendering, armies destroyed. Mussolini had been captured and executed in Italy, yet Hitler vowed he would never be taken alive. Even now, he still dreamed of reversal. He believed that the new jet bombers being tested in Bavaria could strike London again, forcing Britain to reconsider its alliance with the Soviets. He believed that Roosevelt's death in April 1945 would divide the Allies, that American isolationism might re-emerge, leaving Stalin and Churchill at odds. To his mind, the pattern of his early career would repeat itself. Boldness would once again confound his enemies. But this time, the world had learned. The Allies did not break. The Soviet noose tightened every hour. On April 16, 1945, the Battle of Berlin began in earnest. The Red Army poured artillery fire into the city, millions of shells in a few days. Entire districts vanished under bombardment. Soviet tanks rolled through streets where once parades had marched in triumph. Yet still, from his bunker, Hitler issued orders to divisions that no longer existed, moving phantom armies on his maps. His aides whispered that he had lost all sense of reality, but even delusion can command obedience. Generals obeyed orders they knew were meaningless, because to defy him was still a death sentence. By April 22nd, Hitler finally acknowledged what he had never admitted before. The war was lost. Eyewitnesses recalled that he collapsed into his chair, trembling, muttering that everything was ruined, that his generals had betrayed him. Then, just as suddenly, he regained composure and declared he would stay in Berlin and die at his post. He compared himself to Frederick the Great and to the ancient heroes who refused to surrender. To those still around him, he handed out cyanide capsules, calmly preparing for the end. Outside, Soviet forces advanced street by street. On April 25th, they encircled the city completely. Hitler's last allies, Romania, Hungary, Finland, had already fallen or changed sides. Only a few pockets of resistance remained. In those final days, the once powerful Reich existed only on paper. Communications failed, command collapsed, and civilians fled in terror. Yet, even as the empire burned, propaganda broadcasts continued to promise victory. The words had outlived the reality. On April 29th, in the flickering light of his bunker, Hitler married Eva Braun. The ceremony was small, mechanical, almost surreal. He dictated his last will and testament, blaming the Jews, the generals, and the people themselves for Germany's defeat. Not once did he admit error. The man who had once dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich ended it in a room no larger than a basement. The next day, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself while Soviet shells thundered overhead. Eva Braun took poison beside him. Their bodies were carried into the garden, doused in petrol, and burned. The war he had unleashed dragged on for another week, but the architect of its destruction was gone. In the days that followed, Berlin fell, the Reich capitulated, Germany lay divided, Europe in ruins. But as the Allies uncovered the scale of Nazi crimes, the camps, the mass graves, the destruction, they also discovered the extent of his unrealized ambitions. Plans for weapons beyond comprehension filled archives and laboratories. Designs for orbital bombs, supersonic aircraft, even early computers lay hidden in files marked secret. The Reich had not lacked imagination, it had lacked time. Many of those scientists would soon be taken by the victors, some to the United States, others to the Soviet Union, where their work would shape the technologies of the next half-century. The jet age, the space race, the missile era, all bore traces of the empire that almost conquered the world. Historians often debate how close Hitler truly came to victory. Some argue that defeat was inevitable, that the combined power of the Allies would always have overwhelmed him. Yet when one looks closely at Dunkirk, at Moscow, at Stalingrad, at the Atlantic, at the laboratories of Peenemünde, the margin between triumph and catastrophe appears painfully narrow. A few different decisions, a few months of timing, a handful of risks avoided, and the world might have woken to a very different map. Had Hitler succeeded in forcing Britain out of the war in 1940, America might never have entered the conflict. Had he delayed invading the Soviet Union until after victory in the West, the Red Army might never have recovered. Had the oil of the Caucasus fallen into his hands, or the jet program been prioritized earlier, or the Atlantic U-boats perfected sooner, the balance might have tipped decisively. Each missed opportunity, each act of hubris, became another step toward ruin. What truly defeated him was not lack of genius, but excess of it. His refusal to listen, his obsession with control, his belief that destiny alone would obey his will. The same audacity that had brought him to power ultimately consumed him. For every near victory, there was a fatal overreach. Dunkirk followed by delay, Moscow followed by winter, Stalingrad followed by pride, the Ardennes followed by fantasy. History is rarely shaped by certainties. It is shaped by moments of hesitation and arrogance, by decisions made at the edge of reason. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the cost was beyond comprehension. Tens of millions were dead, continents in ruins, and the world forever changed. The dream of empire that Hitler had pursued left behind only ashes and division. But the lessons of his near victories remain. They remind the world how fragile civilization can be, how easily the balance of power can tilt toward darkness when fear and complacency silence resistance. And so the story of Hitler's untold plans is not only a chronicle of what almost happened, it is a warning of how close humanity came to losing its future. For a brief, terrible moment, the world stood on the edge of an abyss, shaped by one man's vision and the obedience of millions. Victory slipped from his grasp by inches, by timing, by fate itself. But in those inches lay the survival of the modern world. In the ruins of Berlin, amid the silence after the last explosions, the idea of the 1,000-year Reich vanished in smoke. What remained were the questions, the what-ifs, the near misses, the ghosts of plans that might have changed everything. History, mercifully, turned away from them, but the shadow of what almost was will always linger, a reminder that the line between domination and destruction is far thinner than anyone dares to believe.